Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on Immortal Planet. This is an isometric hack-and-slash game with some light RPG elements, and you really describe it more as a Souls-like, developed by TW Games and released in July of last year for PC, and it generally went on to get a pretty decent reception, although several of the fans were very perturbed by one of the patch notes, which said added good ending, and there was no good ending added, and the developer later confirmed that it was all a joke in reference to a game he worked on previously called Ronin. Needless to say, that didn't go over very well with the people who wasted an awful lot of time looking for that alternate good ending, but I actually didn't hear about that until I was looking up more information on the game when I was about to make this video, because oddly enough, there's not a whole lot out there on this particular game. I only heard about it because the PR folks contacted me about it and were like, hey, would you like to take a look at this? And full disclosure, they did provide me a review copy to take a look at. But I was kind of surprised by this because Souls-likes are all the rage these days. I mean, obviously you've got the Dark Souls series, you got Bloodborne, you got Neo, you got The Surge, Lords of the Fallen, all that sort of thing out and doing pretty well for themselves. But a game like this comes along and it just kind of flies under the radar. So I figured that given my relatively limited experience with the Souls-like genre, where the only ones I've really played any significant amounts of are Dark Souls 1 and Lords of the Fallen, I'd go ahead and give this a try and see if it ameliorates some of the problems that I had with Dark Souls in particular, and go ahead and see how the isometric perspective changes up the gameplay mechanics and that sort of thing. Because sometimes a camera shift can actually help things out quite a bit. I mean, if you've seen my video on Smite, you know that I don't like MOBAs at all, and yet I actually liked Smite. So that was partly because of the camera's perspective, but it was also because the controls changed. So let's go ahead and start delving into this and seeing what we're dealing with here, and like always, I'll go ahead and start with presentation. As I said before, the game uses an isometric perspective, and it does not have any sort of rotation in the camera at all, meaning that the game always takes place from the same visual perspective, which is fine considering it's got 2D visuals, which are actually rather nice. They're decently colorful, although they do go for a lot of darker shades, and it does end up being a fairly unique art style in the grand scheme of things. Of course, it's not exactly packed with impressive visuals, so they have to make a lot more use out of aesthetics than they do out of actual visual quality, and they do generally manage to pull it off pretty well. There is, however, one pretty nasty issue with the visuals, which is more from gameplay implications than the actual looks, because the animations actually look pretty solid. It's just that they have very low frame counts, which has implications on what you can actually do in the gameplay. So I'll get to that more in a moment. For now, let's go ahead and move over into the sound design, which is a bit all over the place. On the one hand, the sound effects themselves generally do the job okay, although you do have some odd sounds with regards to particular weapon swings, and the gunshots are extremely wimpy. Aside from that, there's no voice acting to speak of, but the soundtrack is actually pretty solid. It features in particular a lot of choral arrangement mixed in with a bunch of electronic and other instruments, and it actually ends up working out pretty well for the game in general, although it does get a bit repetitive here and there. So overall, the presentation is pretty solid, but what really matter are story and gameplay, and that's where you run into a lot of issues. Now, I didn't finish the game, so I don't know the full story, but the basics are that you play as what is known as an Awake Walker, which is an immortal who has waken up from cryo-sleep and is wandering around and exploring the world. In fact, the entire planet is inhabited by immortals, most of whom are just losing their minds from being stuck in this endless cycle of rebirth, so you're ultimately trying to figure out what's going on with that and how you can manage to escape. Much like a lot of the other Souls-like games, most of the story is told to you either in the various item descriptions of things you find along the way, or through some very specific NPCs scattered around the area that you'll converse with on occasion. But unlike, say, Dark Souls, where the game explains literally nothing to you unless you just delve through every single item description in the game, all the item descriptions really serve to do is flesh out a bit of information on what that item does and why it's significant. All the main story elements are actually told to you explicitly, which allows you to have some sort of grounding in what's going on and why you're doing it. Now that said, It's not that much more grounding than something like Dark Souls, so it helps, but it doesn't ultimately resolve the issue. And like I said, I wasn't able to finish the game, so I didn't get the full story that someone who finishes the game might, but here's the problem with that. I had no drive to finish the game, and it was entirely because of the gameplay. As I mentioned before, this game is a Souls-like, which means that whenever your character dies, you respawn at whatever particular cryo chamber you have activated most recently, and whatever experience you had is left on the ground wherever you died, so you have to go back and find that and pick it back up, and you use this experience to level up, of course. It gets spent directly into giving yourself points of, for example, strength, agility, willpower, etc. And you get different effects depending on which stats you increase. So, for example, if you increase your strength, you're going to do more damage, you're going to have more health. Whereas if you increase your endurance, you're going to have more health and stamina, and your armor stat is going to very gradually increase. There's also an interesting factor where if you increase your willpower, then gradually you get bonus spell uses, and if you increase your intelligence, you gradually get bonus item uses, but in the case of the bonus item uses, that only happens for certain items. And those items do not include your healing item. The only way you can improve the amount of healing items you're carrying is to just find them scattered around the world, because you get additional uses whenever you pick up a new one, which wouldn't necessarily be a problem if you had more than a single use on respawn. Even when you first get the Estus Flask in Dark Souls, you get more than one use of it, and whenever you go and rest at a bonfire, it automatically replenishes however many you've lost. And you can eventually upgrade the amount of uses the Estus Flask has, which allows you to make mistakes but still recover from them. Immortal Planet, on the other hand, punishes your mistakes so heavily that it outright encourages you to just creep along and effectively save scum, even though you can't really do that. The problem with doing that is that the stats have such an absolutely minimal effect on your actual combat ability that the experiences don't really matter all that much. I put 20 points into endurance and didn't notice a single difference. I still took the same amount of damage, I still could do the same number of swings, I could still do the same amount of dodging and the same amount of blocking. It didn't really seem to matter. So the game outright sends you mixed signals. On the one hand, it encourages you to play as slowly and methodically as possible to avoid losing your experience, but then the experience doesn't really matter all that much, and you end up just going through the game slowly and methodically to avoid taking damage as much as you possibly can, just so you don't have to backtrack. And you will definitely be doing a lot of backtracking in this game because, like most other Souls-like games, it is overly reliant on trial and error, but it's to an even worse degree than those other games, precisely because of the way the combat system works. You see, the entirety of combat in Immortal Planet revolves around stamina meters, not just your own, but your enemies as well. And you can see the enemy stamina meters, which allows you to judge whether or not they're going to be unleashing a combo on you, or whether you can actually stun them, because if their stamina is really low, and you either shoot them or you dash into them, then it will stun them, and you can just proceed to wail on them for a couple of seconds. But of course, you use stamina whenever you dash, whenever you attack, and whenever you block. So you need to manage your own stamina while also simultaneously managing your enemy's stamina, which is a bit tricky depending on what you're fighting. For example, if you're fighting boss enemies, a lot of times they have very large reserves of stamina, and their attack patterns dictate that they have a pretty heavy reserve even after they've finished their combo, so stunning them is pretty tricky, but stunning the basic enemies is not that difficult because they have a habit of overextending themselves. But of course, you have to be careful not to overextend yourself as well, and on top of that, you have to be very careful with how you're moving, because there are two different defensive moves you can do when you're attacked. You can either block, which doesn't work against everything. If it's a ranged attack or a spell effect, then it just goes straight through your block like it's nothing. So in those cases, you're going to need to dodge, whereas you can either dodge melee attacks or you can block them. And if you block them, if you time the block right, it's a perfect block, and it consumes no stamina. Similarly, if you time your dash just right, then you'll actually regain the amount of stamina that you used to dash, so it effectively consumes no stamina as well. So on paper, that might sound pretty appealing because you might think, oh, well, that means that it's a skill-based combat system. Not really. It's a trial and error-based combat system, because that animation problem I mentioned before, yeah, you have no real way of knowing whether an enemy is about to unleash a combo, or a spell, or is about to shoot at you, or is only going to attack you once, or is going to dash into you based on whatever move they're doing until it's too late. This is particularly true for melee attacks because whenever an enemy attacks you with melee, it's always the same initial wind-up, which means that you're getting basically one frame of animation to tell you whether or not this is going to be a combo or just a single strike. They normally do a slightly different maneuver for if they're going to cast a spell or if they're going to shoot at you, and some enemies will flash red before they charge at you, and some others will flash red before they shoot at you, so it becomes a matter of just having to memorize every single attack pattern of every single enemy, which again, you're not going to necessarily know what they're doing until the attacks already hit you at least once. To make matters worse, if you dodge into an enemy and they're not low on stamina, you get stunned instead, which means they get to wail on you for a couple of seconds. And you may think, oh, well, that's not that big of a deal, just don't dodge into an enemy. But I've tried to dodge away from enemies before, and either ended up falling off of a ledge, or I dodged into a different enemy because the angle with which I moved the stick apparently wasn't the exact angle that was required, because it's actually a bit difficult to judge exactly how you need to move the sticks in order to actually dodge away from enemies versus towards them, thanks to the isometric perspective. In a full 3D game like, say, Dark Souls or Lords of the Fallen or any of the other Souls-like games that are in a full 3D environment, you can move the stick in a general direction, and based on the way the camera's facing, that's how you're gonna move. You don't get that with Immortal Planet, so you have to adjust all of your movement to this one specific perspective, and even then, the way you actually move around is closer to a D-pad than what you get with an analog stick, so it ends up being kind of tricky to get all of the movements exactly right. And given how severely the game punishes your mistakes, those tiny errors in where you move the analog stick or how quickly you press the block button really start to add up to becoming an extremely frustrating game. But the icing on the cake there is the boss fights, because when you go and you fight a boss, the first phase is going to be pretty straightforward. They're probably only going to have one, maybe two attacks. And then phase 2 begins once you reduce their health bar down to 0, and they move on to their second health bar. And then they get a new attack, maybe more than one. And then you get them down to the third stage. And now they've got even more attacks, and they're doing them all in sequence, and they're probably still full on stamina. This wouldn't necessarily be a problem if they had more than maybe one frame of animation to show you what they're going to do, and they had some sort of obvious tell as to what they were going to do, as opposed to giving you a very vague single frame of animation wind-up, and then just unleashing into whatever it is they're doing. Sometimes they do. For example, there's the first boss of the game, which has a jumping attack that it does. It leaps up in the air, and then a circle appears on the ground somewhere, and you can dodge out of the way of that. Okay, that's fine. It gives you some sort of indication as to what they're doing before it actually happens. But then, for example, there's the prison boss, where the very first thing he does is charge you, which then immediately stuns you, and he follows that up with a sword attack. And then, once you get him down to phase 2, after you've gotten the hang of his sword attack and his charging attack, then he does a very quick laser beam attack that shoots across the ground, sets it ablaze, and will probably hit you for massive damage the first time. And then, on top of all of this, his third attack is effectively an area denial attack, which spawns a bunch of floating orbs that, if you get close enough, will automatically track you, throw themselves at you, and do massive damage if they hit you. And again, this is not a matter of predicting what the enemy is going to do based on how they're winding up. It's a matter of they have basically one or two frames of animation that are very minimal and have very vague connotations, and then when they actually unleash the attack, that's when you find out what they were going to do. So you just have to get into a pattern of memorizing the exact tells, and that just requires an excessive amount of trial and error. And while that's a problem that plagues other Souls-likes, it's especially bad in Immortal Planet's case because you can make so few mistakes before dying in this. So even though the game certainly has some interesting ideas in terms of the whole stamina management mechanic and the fact that you can stun enemies by taking advantage of their stamina and that sort of thing, and every single one of the weapons in this game has both an awakened and unawakened state, which will be pretty familiar to you if you've played Bloodborne with the whole trick weapon idea, where if you hold down the attack button in this, then it will switch it between the awakened and unawakened state, and if you're in the unawakened state and you press and hold the button down, then it will unleash a powerful attack along with it. And even though the game's really not that long and it'll basically run on a toaster, it's ultimately not enough to save the overall experience from being extremely frustrating to the point of outright making me angry at times. It's one thing for a game to be difficult through requiring skill. It's another thing entirely for the game to be difficult because it stacks the deck against you. To be difficult because it throws an enemy at you that you've never encountered before, that you have no idea what its attack pattern is, and that its wind-ups are so vague that there's no way you could possibly tell what's going on until it hits you. Because that's not really difficult. All that does is test your patience, because all that requires to beat is trial and error. And if all the game requires to beat is trial and error, and you just keep going at something until eventually you get through it, not because you've gotten better at the game, but simply because you've memorized everything because you've been blocking their attacks with your face too much. And I legitimately have no idea why people find that kind of repetition enjoyable. This game doesn't really require any sort of strategy. It doesn't even really require any sort of skill. It just requires an excessive amount of patience. And my patience with it ran out quite a long time ago. Thus, you get this MTO rather than a full review. Because the core problems that are preventing me from enjoying it now are not the kind of thing that can be fixed simply by playing it longer. In fact, they're only going to be exacerbated by playing it longer. Therefore, I decided to just go ahead and cut my losses and get this MTO done. And sorry that it's not a full review, but I just see no reason to force myself to finish this particular game. If for some reason it still appeals to you after this video, then I will still have a link in the video description box to where you can pick it up on Steam, but I can't really recommend it. Thank you all very much for watching, and I will catch you all in later videos.